Welcome back to another episode of the Code Podcast. I'm your host, Marilyn, and my guest today is Dr. Félix Menéndez. He has a doctorate in canon law, a licentiate in sacred theology, and a master's in international relations. And along with this, Dr. Menéndez has a YouTube channel where he provides helpful resources about the marriage annulment process and grounds for annulment. Welcome to the Code, Dr. Menéndez.
Thank you for having me, Marilyn.
Thank you so much for giving up your time to be interviewed. I really appreciate it. I thought it'd be a great start to the interview to have a bit of a chat about how you came to be involved in canon law and what led you to discerning this study.
Well, in my case, it was love at first sight, I think is the expression. I was studying theology, and in the fifth year, you have this course of Introduction to Canon Law. And to me, it was, I want to do this. But actually, the experience that really decided me was that year when I was studying that course. There was a question in my canon law school in Madrid, in San Damaso, about whether a marriage was valid or not, a baptism was valid or not, right? So they wanted to know if a person was baptized or not, in order to baptize her again or not. And we had two teachers that I love and respect very much. One of them was my canon law teacher, and the other one was my liturgy teacher, amazing theologian, a man from whom I have learned so much. So they asked both. And the theologian gave this long-winded explanation of things, went into the history, this and that and the other. And the canon law professor asked 5 or 6 questions. Did this happen? Did this happen? And I asked about the facts and gave a crisp, clear answer. And I said, I want to be that guy. That's what I want to do with my life. I want to be the guy who gives clear answers. So,
was that your theology study, or was that your canon law study you were just talking about?
Oh, this is, well, I was studying the basics, how do you say, the institutional cycle of theology. So the first 5 years.
Okay. Yeah. And so when did you then come to study canon law?
Oh, I had to make a winded road before I was able to study canon law. So I studied 2 more years, got my moral theology degree, then stopped studying. I was working for 3 years, and then I began canon law studies, which was 3 years to get the licentiate, and then 2 more years for the doctorate.
Okay, and in your doctoral studies, what was your area of focus?
Well, I've been always focused until a few months ago exclusively in marriage law. So my JCL is about the exclusion of the sacramental dignity of marriage. The doctoral dissertation is a study on how the mentality about marriage affects the validity of marriage. So a type of error. And then I've been working in tribunals all these years. Like, I don't know how long it's been, like 10, 15 years. And only recently, in August, I was appointed chancellor here in Harvard. So now I am rediscovering all these other parts of canon law. I'm doing mergers, penal law, a lot of cases, very sad cases, and cleaning the gutters of the church, if you will. And administrative questions, counseling the archbishop.
That sounds like a very involved role that you're in, Dr. Menéndez. You touched on your thesis in your canonical studies to do with marriage law, and particularly error as one of the grounds. I just thought maybe we could chat a bit more in this episode about that. And so I thought we might start with consent at the time of marriage. So what is valid consent? What does that look like canonically and theologically speaking?
That's a question that can take us for many hours in a journey, right? So maybe the easiest way to answer what is valid consent is by explaining what is an invalid consent, right?
Sure.
Um, so there are three things that can make a marriage invalid,
Mhm.
right? One is lack of canonical form. That's only for Catholics. So
Mhm.
Catholics who attempt marriage outside of the canonical form do not get married. Second are the impediments, which are 12 laws, and only 12, that make naturally sufficient consent invalid, right?
Mhm.
For instance, the priest who attempts marriage, or the cousins who attempt marriage without a dispensation. And then the queen of invalidities, the queen of nullities, is the defects of consent or vices of consent.
Mhm.
Now,
Right.
consent is what creates marriage. Marriage is not created by God. Marriage is not, I mean, the institution of marriage is created by God, but every single marriage is not made by God, by the president, by the pope, by the priest.
Mhm.
So it's by two free wills that give each other, a man and a woman, thus creating a family in a permanent
Mhm.
relationship.
Mhm.
That is the minimum basic nucleus of marriage. When a man and a woman agree to that, then they create a marriage. So whenever that agreement is missing something essential, something fundamental, that is an invalid consent. And that is what we deal
Right.
mostly
Of
in
course.
ecclesiastical tribunals.
In your tribunal work, what are the grounds attached to these three modes of invalid consent?
Well, lack of form, it's very common in the United States.
Hmm.
However, because it is such a mixed country with so many religions, and also with a big divorce culture, so here people get married so many times in their life,
Mm.
it's crazy.
Yeah.
Lack of form, which is typically done that, so the investigation to make sure that happened, that so a Catholic tried to marry outside in most of the world, that is considered in the prenuptial file. So
Mm.
for listeners who don't know about these things, in the paperwork you do at the parish when you're going to marry. For instance, the Queen of Spain. I always give this example. So Queen Letizia was, of course, baptized Catholic, like
Hmm.
most Spanish. She was civilly married and then divorced, and then she married the then Prince, today King of Spain.
Hmm.
And to deal with this, that was done in the prenuptial file. You put there the certificate of baptism to be sure that this person was Catholic at the time of the wedding, the civil marriage certificate, and the civil divorce. That's it. We
Hmm.
know you're free to marry in regards to that. So the Catholic Church doesn't request a trial to prove the nullity of that union, right?
Right.
So merely civil marriages of Catholics are not invalid. They are they are inexistent, to be
Right.
precise. Right?
Right.
So lack of forms, which for non-Americans may sound a bit weird of expression. I don't know how it's done in Australia. I mean, maybe you are very influenced by the Anglosphere, but in the rest of the canonical world, this is not a thing. Lack of forms here are conducted at the chancery or at the diocesan
Right.
tribunal.
Right.
Impediments are very uncommon except prior bond here in the States because people have so many marriages.
Of course.
There are cases of prior bond, right? So I married someone and now I want to marry someone else, but that someone that I married first had been married before. So my first marriage was invalid because of prior
Right.
bond,
Okay.
right? And then very, very uncommon things, but I've done a few. Like, for instance, I've done a case of abduction, right? So
Right.
coming from deep Mexico, where chauvinism is rampant, right? And
Mm.
women can be taken by a man, many
Yes.
times in
Yes.
agreement,
Yeah.
but many times by force, which is
Hmm.
despicable, right? So I had
Right.
one, but this is not common at all.
Okay.
So in tribunal experience, most cases are defects of consent, and out
Okay.
of those, most of them are considered under the ground of incapacity.
Right. Okay.
It is a new ground, relatively new. So it appears in the new code. It was not in well, there was one form of incapacity, the amentia, right, or nowadays called insufficient use of reason,
Mm.
but it didn't have the constant use that we see today, right?
Right.
Mostly because we've learned more about psychology, right? So
Mm.
in the last century, in the last decades, we've deepened into our understanding of human psychology, so we understand better how the the person can be limited to give a free consent, to give a minimally human act when they are assenting to marry, or when they are appearing to assent to marriage.
Right.
And then after incapacity grounds, mostly the famous grave defect of discretion of judgment,
Hmm.
there is also a lot of incapacity to assume the essential obligations of marriage. And then after that come a few exclusions,
Right.
right? We can talk about those if you want, and then errors, and then the rest are also very seldom, like most, like in most things in life, right? A majority of I don't know, class students don't give trouble, right? It's always 20% that give you 80% of the work. The majority of the space in the universe is empty, right? So this is how life is, right? There are a few
Right.
grounds that are considered most of the times, and then most of the grounds are seldom considered.
Right. And so you mentioned error and exclusion. So we might chat a bit about that if you're happy to. Why are error and exclusion such central grounds in determining whether true consent was ever given in a marriage?
Mhm. Mhm. Well, it's because consent is a human act. Okay. So we do acts as humans that are not human acts. Okay. I'm quoting Aquinas here. So
Hmm.
you have actus humanus and actus hominis. So acts of the human and acts of the, and human acts. Okay. So some things we do like, I don't know, snoring while we sleep, right? That is not a human act. You are not compos sui when you are doing that. You're not the owner, the master of that action, right? That action is done without you. Aquinas says, like moving your feet while you walk or scratching your beard, right? Those are actions that we perform, but we don't perform them engaging our intellect and our will. Okay, so
Right.
an action to be truly human needs to be an action in which you know what you're doing, so the intellectual part is working, right, and in which you choose to do that thing, right? So actually, if you, and I guess most of our listeners are Catholics, right? If you consider sin, right, for a sin to be mortal, it needs to have three characteristics, right?
Hmm.
So remember your catechism, right? The first one is that it needs to be a matter that is grave, right?
Hmm.
So a mortal sin is not that I did a minor little thingy there. No, I mean it has to be about something important. After that, the other two conditions are precisely these things, right?
Mm.
That is a really human act. First, that you know that this thing is a sin, right? Because if you honestly don't know that this is a sin, then it cannot be a mortal sin because you are
Mm.
unaware of what you're doing. And second, you need to really want to do it. I mean, not in a psychological sense. Oh, I really didn't know what I was doing, right? No,
Yeah.
in the sense that this is actually what you are choosing to do. I mean, it's like if you are hunting and you think you're hunting a deer and you shoot a man, you are not a murderer, okay? You committed manslaughter, right? That was a homicide, but it was not murder because you didn't want to kill a human being. You just were unaware of what was going on, and you were not choosing to murder. Okay, so that's why these two grounds are central, right? So until the so, if I'm not mistaken, the grounds of incapacity appear in the jurisprudence of the Rota in the 50s, in the 1950s.
Right. Okay.
So until then, incapacity was very rare. So the only cases in which incapacity was considered were the the cases in which someone was incapable of human action at all, right? So cases of people with heavy mental problems, right? People who could like who were impaired for any type of adult act at all, right? Um, but after the 50s, these incapacity grounds start to develop. Before that, exclusion and error are the main grounds, the grounds that are most considered, right? Because they come from that part of the
Right.
of our human nature that creates consent. And since marriage is created by consent, it's only natural that error and exclusion, so the shortcomings of intellect and will, if you want, are
Mm-hmm.
the reasons why marriages can be invalid.
Right. Okay. Well, we might look at error specifically, and we'll get to exclusion in a minute. So, canon law distinguishes between error of a person and error of the quality of the person. So, what's the difference between the two?
Mm-hmm. Well, there is a bigger distinction,
Mm-hmm.
which is error facti, right? And
Mm-hmm.
error juris. So you have the error about the fact and error about the law. In the
Mm-hmm.
sense, so you can be mistaken about two things when it comes to marriage. You can be mistaken about the person you're marrying or about the deal you're striking, so to say,
Right.
right? So you
Yes.
can be. So I think I'm marrying you, but I am marrying Melissa. Okay, that is an error about the person,
Mm-hmm.
and I can be thinking that I am celebrating your birthday, and actually this is our wedding. So that's an error
Right.
about the the marriage. So it's what we call error about the law or error of law,
Mm-hmm.
error juris. When it comes to the error about the facts, right? You have that distinction you just made very well. So we have error of person and error of quality. Traditionally, it was taught that only the error about the person makes the marriage invalid, right? Error about qualities of the person do not make the marriage invalid. Um, because when it comes to error, right, it is the essence that matters, not the circumstances. For instance, when you choose to study canon law, okay,
Mm-hmm.
you decide, okay, I'm going to study canon law. You don't choose every single course from the beginning, right? So you
Mm.
agree in your mind, you say, okay, I've made this commitment, I'm going to study canon law. But you have not decided on every single detail. You have not decided that you're going to sit down with this person to listen to that course that you're going to take 5 years from now, right?
Mm.
Because these are circumstantial elements of your decision to study canon law, right? When it comes to marriage, the essence of marriage is what matters. So I am going to strike this deal, right? Which is to establish a permanent partnership so that we have children and we raise them together. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
With this person. Okay. Those are the essential elements.
Mm.
If I am in error about a quality of my wife, that doesn't make my commitment invalid, right? But if
Right.
I am in error about the identity of my wife, it does. So if I want to marry Marilyn, but instead of Marilyn, right, she's covered like in the famous story of the Bible, right? And then when I take the veil off, it's some other woman,
Mm.
right? I am not married because I wanted to marry Marilyn, not this other person that is in front of
Right.
me,
Right.
right? But if I, which is by the way, error about the quality is an error that happens in every single marriage. So
Mm. Mm-hmm.
like you can joke about it all you want, like oh, he snores, yeah. You didn't know that, right? Oh, she's kind of a dictator sometimes, right? Well, I didn't know this. When you were my girlfriend, you were all nice. You are like acting like this. Wow, right? So it happens always because we're not God, because we don't know everything. So we
Mm-hmm.
have so much to discover about our partners, right? So error about the quality does not make the marriage invalid. However, if the error is like a condition that I put on the marriage, right?
Right.
So then it can render the consent invalid, right? My thesis director wrote his thesis about this topic, right? Error residensing qualitate sine qua non was the title. So an error that becomes a quality sine qua non, without which there is no deal, right?
Right.
For instance, I meet someone in school, right? And I've always, all my life, wanted to marry a university professor. And for whatever reason, I think he's a university professor because everybody calls him professor. And we don't talk about it. And then we end up getting married. And then after the wedding, right, I realized that he's the janitor, that he's not the professor that I thought he was,
Mhm.
right? And to me, it was written in stone. I will only marry if the man is a university professor. I don't care how wealthy he is. I don't care how handsome he is. I don't care how tall he is. I don't care
Mhm.
about anything. I need this quality. He needs to be a marriage professor. Of course, this is a very uh, unlikely case, but I am just
Yes, yes, of
giving it
course.
like for
Of
understanding the
course.
point, right? In that case, you have an error about a condition, right? That is
Right.
the famous error in quality principally and directly intended, right? In that case, which is very particular, very uncommon, then the marriage would be invalid. Now, this, as it happens with so many of our canonical laws, has been misinterpreted many times by many tribunals, by many judges, right? Like,
Right.
oh, yeah, error in quality, error about equality, right? There is also a funny thing about these grounds of error about the person, right? Which is how language betrays us, right? So many times you see, and sorry, Marilyn, but it's typically women who say these things, right?
Right.
He's not the man I married anymore, right? He's not the man I married anymore. So you say, see, error in person, right? Because she thought she was marrying one guy
Right,
and
right.
he was marrying another. Well, that's a metaphorical way of speaking. Of course, he's numerically and identically the same man you married. He's just
Of course.
acting different. And you're expressing that difference in action, in way of behaving with
Mm.
this metaphorical way of you are like a different man, but you're not a different man. You're the same guy. You're just you at home and showing your worst part, right?
That is very interesting actually to find out the difference between the two. We might we might move to the ground of exclusion. So what is this ground? How would you explain that to someone who's not a canonist?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's very simple. The exclusion is that you exclude from the thing the act of choosing something that is essential, right? So marriage is a permanent
Mm.
partnership between a man and a woman open to procreation, right? If you
Mhm.
exclude deliberately any of these elements from your consent, then that thing is not marriage, right?
Right.
So
Okay.
this is, I think, the reason why this is so difficult to understand nowadays is because marriage is suffering the worst crisis of its history, right? So
Right.
marriage is probably the oldest contract of humanity, right? We don't know when it started. So we know we've been having marriage in humanity since before recorded history, right?
Right.
And
Yeah.
right now, because of some circumstances, I personally think it is because of the pill, so
Right.
the
Of course.
sexual
Contraception. Yes.
revolution that comes
Yeah.
after this new technology that allows women and men to regulate when they can have children, right? That distorts completely our understanding of marriage.
Of
So
course.
you only need to go 1, 2 generations ago, whatever it is for you before the 60s, right? One, two, maybe for very, very young people, it's 3 generations. But I mean, what, after the introduction of common, available, cheap contraceptives, marriage had to be understood differently by
Mhm.
most of society. And we are living in a different world when people believe that they can decide about when to have children, right? That is new. That is different, right? We didn't have
Yes.
that before.
Yes. Yeah.
And well, the other probably is that the other vector here is the development, the financial, economical development that allows a woman or a single person, right? But the novelty is that one woman can live on her own and raise children out
Mm.
of her own soul work. That is a novelty in history, right? Actually, in many parts of the world, that is still not true, right? I mean,
Yes,
we
of
all
course.
know in developed countries, we all know women who, with a lot of hard work, had done it. Like they've raised a family on their own. That is
Yes.
unthinkable until, yeah, 1, 2 generations ago, right? Still, I repeat, in many places of the world, that is still not a thing. That's why in
Mm.
the Bible, taking care of the widows and orphans is the main work of charity,
Of
because
course.
becoming a widow was a curse. A curse. I mean,
Mm.
in India they burn the widows alive with the with the husbands, right?
Yes, yeah.
because because what are you going to do? I mean, how are you going to live, right? You cannot go to an office and have a work like today, and most people
Yes.
lived in misery, so let alone one woman who has to raise children, right? So these things are distorting our understanding of marriage. And for instance, a ground that was not common, and now it's becoming very, very common, is the exclusion of children, right?
Right. Okay.
So people who, at the time of consent, decide to not have children, right? That is now much easier to do than it was 100 years ago.
Thank you for that explanation. That's a very interesting explanation and puts it into perspective. Obviously, the progression of society and what was normal is probably now changed completely, like you outlined. Obviously, now women, I guess, are more independent and choosing to be in many forms. So, what would you say are the most common forms then of this exclusion ground?
Well, I would say by this order, most common ground of exclusion, I think, is exclusion of children nowadays.
Hmm.
If
Hmm.
it's not children, it is fidelity,
Right.
right?
Okay.
So the sexual revolution has really dismantled society in that sense, right?
Right. Okay.
So couples who choose not to have children, couples who both in agreement or one of them decides not to have children at all. First ground, exclusion of children. Second, exclusion of fidelity. Exclusion of indissolubility. It's also very commonly proposed,
Hmm.
but not so commonly true. I mean, the marriage was not so
Right.
frequently invalid because of exclusion of indissolubility. And total simulation, so exclusion of
Mm.
marriage as such, and then exclusion of sacramentality, which is very rare. And
Hmm.
then there is a new ground, exclusion of the good of the spouses, that I think it's probably abused, right, and used for cases in which, yes, the person was not morally upstanding or something, and but no,
So what
that's
does it actually, what does the term mean, exclusion of the good of the spouse?
if you want the short expression, you want the short answer or the long answer. So exclusion of the good of the spouses, I personally think it's a mistake to even use that ground, right?
Right. Okay.
I mean, except with a very, very, rare, uh, very rare cases. So I can think of a few cases, right? Like, let me give you one of these crazy cases so imagine a movie, right, that starts with a mafia murder, right? So this mafia enforcer goes to a family reunion and kills everyone there, right?
Mm.
Huge mafia vendetta, right?
Mm.
And then the before cutting to black, right? You see a little girl crawling out of the scene, right?
Mhm.
And among blood and such, she's the only survivor, right? And it cuts to
Yeah.
black, right? And then in the screen you read 15 years later, right? And then 15 years later, she's this grown up, gorgeous woman, right? That goes on to seduce the mafia enforcer to make and marry him to make his life a living hell, right?
Mm. Mhm.
That would be a case of exclusion of the good of the spouses. That marriage would be invalid because at the time of the wedding, that woman is bent on making his life a living hell. She
Right.
wants to take any possible good from the husband, right?
Right.
The
Right.
idea from this ground comes from the two goals or goods of marriage, right?
Mm-hmm.
So marriage is ordered by nature
Mm-hmm.
to the mutual help, so for the good of the spouses, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it's good to have a partner in life, right? And for the good of the children, right? Traditionally, the good of the children was considered higher than the good of the spouses, but it was about the time of John Paul II that the church kind of deepened or evolved in that understanding, stating that the good of the spouses and the good of the children are like the two sides of one coin, right? And it's
Right.
true.
Yeah.
I mean, what is best for our children than to have parents who love each other, right? And
Mm-hmm.
what is best for parents as to be together, giving their lives to these children so that they grow up
Mm-hmm.
and get to be great humans
Mm.
and they're going to heaven, right? And be holy. And so we've always had the ground of exclusion of children since forever ago. So
Mhm.
I guess one genius said, "Oh, if I can exclude children, I guess I can also exclude the good of the spouses."
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
But again, and I said it with other grounds, but it's not uncommon that this happens, right? There is
Right.
a
Of
a
course.
fine thread of jurisprudence that sees one very very extreme case, and then that opens the dam, so to breaks the dam,
Mm.
right? And then a lot of tribunals are saying, well, he was a very bad man, therefore he excluded the good of the wife, right? That is ridiculous,
Mm.
right? That is
Mm.
not an invalid marriage, right? You can marry a bad person, so evil people can marry.
Yes. Yeah. That's.
That's it, right? The fact that someone acted bad, had a even horrible behavior during the marriage doesn't make the marriage invalid, right? Because what creates marriage is not how we behave after the wedding. What creates marriage is what we do on the day of the wedding, on the very precise moment when we celebrate the contract of marriage,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
right? When when they get married, even if they are evil, right? If they want to establish a permanent partnership between a man and a woman open to procreation, that is a marriage, right?
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And even the worst abusers don't get married with the idea of harming their wives or their
Mm.
husbands, by the
Mm-hmm.
way, because I've had also cases of abusing wives.
Mm.
I don't like
Yes.
this idea
Yes.
that abuse is only against women by
Yes.
men.
Of course. That's
That is
very
a
true.
terrible lie.
Yes.
And by the way, in the cases that I've had where the man was the abused partner, it's double damn because the poor guy has to endure the emotional and physical abuse of the wife,
Mm.
and on top of that, the shame because society is gonna say,
Of
"Ha, you
course.
loser! You allow her to
Yes.
to be."
Yeah. That's so sad.
It's
Yeah.
terrible situation.
Mm.
But in that case, right, the fact that she behaved like this doesn't make the marriage invalid, right?
Mm.
Necessarily. I mean, we need to look into it. But it is not like, oh, if someone is an abuser, the marriage is invalid. No. I mean, you need to, did they want to abuse on the day of the wedding? I mean, that's not that common, right?
Mm.
Many
Mm-hmm.
times you get married with your best intentions. Most of the times you get married with the best of intentions. And
Yes.
then
Yes.
life is complicated and marriages deteriorate, right? That's why I say being in love on the day of the wedding is really not very important,
Mm.
right? What is
Right.
very important is to have virtue on the day of the wedding,
Of
right?
course. What is the proof that the tribunal's looking for, given that their grounds of error and exclusion both deal with interior intention?
Mhm. Well, the tribunal needs to look into facts, right? So we need to, so to say, reconstruct the act of the will. In a case of exclusion, right? Someone is claiming before the tribunal, well, on day X, I married Y, but that marriage was not true because
Mm.
I or this other person withhold this thing from consent. So deliberately chose not to give me that right, for instance, to be the father of her children or to
Mm.
be his exclusive sexual partner, etc. Right? So
Right.
what we need to do is to ascertain to be morally certain that this is what happened. And
Mm-hmm.
of course, these things happen inside of our minds, right? These are
Mm.
metaphysical realities. We cannot use a video to
Yes.
learn about
Mm.
this.
Mm-hmm.
Well, sometimes we do, but not directly, right? You cannot look into the mind. You need to
Mm.
first get the person to confess, right? That's why
Yes.
exclusion is sometimes a difficult ground because you need the person to say, well, yeah, at the time of the wedding, like for instance, um, very many years ago, had this case of exclusion of fidelity, right? Which is a difficult ground, right? Because it's
Mm.
typically the spouse who was cheated on that says, "See, they cheated on me, therefore exclusion of fidelity." Right, and they don't understand that the exclusion of fidelity is not the exclusion de facto that happens during the marriage, is
Mm.
the exclusion de jure, so the will to be unfaithful, right,
Right.
at the time
Okay.
of the wedding. So if I marry you and I say I want to be your husband, I want you to be my wife, I want us to have children together, but I am going probably to have other women because I know I'm feeble and weak, and
Mm.
women are beautiful and yada yada. That is not invalid.
Mm.
Invalidity comes from when it comes to exclusion from a determinate will that is stronger than the will to marry. So
Right.
I'm gonna marry you, but I need to have other women. If I cannot do this, I don't want to marry you. That is
Right.
what makes marriage invalid, right?
Okay.
So the exclusion needs to be prevalent. It cannot be just an error, right? A thought that, well, I know this may happen. Or even if you're certain, because you are, I don't know, a womanizer, right? Well, actually, in this case, I was going to tell you about the husband of the marriage came to the tribunal. He was the respondent and declared under oath that he was a womanizer. So that he had learned the mysteries of the female heart,
Mm-hmm.
if you like Back to the Future, there is this famous moment when Doc says, "No, I'm going to destroy the time machine and I'm going to devote the rest of my life to study the other great mystery of the universe, women," right? So this guy said that he was a pickup artist. So he was an expert seducer. He was able to talk women into getting with him, right?
Right.
And he
Right.
confessed very humbly, right, that at the time of the wedding, he was fooling her, the petitioner, into yeah, believing that he was really in love with her and that he
Right.
wanted to be exclusive, but actually he was seeing other women. And he even confessed that the day before the wedding, he slept at the home of an ex-girlfriend.
Right. Okay.
And he said that he had changed his ways, that he was not like that anymore. He converted from that. But that would be a true case of exclusion of fidelity, right? On the
Right.
day of the
Okay.
wedding, he
Mm-hmm.
was determined to have other women. He,
Right.
he really, really, really wanted it. And if he was told, well, you got to choose, you cannot have both, then he wouldn't have married.
Right.
So the will to exclude was prevalent,
Right.
and the marriage
Okay.
was declared invalid.
So, in light of what we've just been talking about these grounds, what would you suggest to engaged couples that they should know about consent before they're married in the lead up to their marriage that they may not be
Mhm.
hearing during their marriage prep?
Mm. Well, as you said in the beginning, before I studied canon law, I studied moral theology.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was studying in San Damaso in Madrid, I don't think it's like that anymore. I'm not sure, but at the time, and I'm getting old, so this is longer than I would like to recognize ago. Um, my teachers were all with the John Paul II Institute for Marriage and Family. So we were very bent on studying marriage, right?
Mhm.
My teacher, Juan Jose Perez Soba, who's like, I mean, I want to believe the best moralist of Spain. Um, I'm sure students of other schools would disagree. He said that the preparation for marriage is not a course you take right before marriage. Your
Mm.
preparation for marriage prep is your life with your family
Of
when you grow
course.
up.
Of
Is what you
course.
see your mom and your dad do. So for couples who are getting married, if they are faithful to the Lord, I mean, if they believe, if they have faith, grow in that because that's gonna save your marriage. For everybody, whether you're a believer or not, you need virtue. So marriage is going to suck. Marriage is going to be tough. You're going to have horrible times when your partner, your spouse is going to become your worst enemy, right? And you're going to have fights and you're going to need to forgive each other. So what you really, really, really need is to grow in virtue, to learn to be patient, to learn to
Of
be
course.
understanding, to endure
Yes.
pain, to endure
Mm.
suffering, to be kind, to be forgiving. You need to be holy in the end, right?
Mm. Mhm.
That's the real marriage prep, right?
Mm.
So the the ins and outs of validity are very different from the what it takes to have a happy or successful marriage.
Yes, of
And
course.
I think that's a crux for us,
Mm-hmm.
canon lawyers in ecclesiastical tribunals, that
Mm.
most people want us to just say, yeah, because it didn't work out, the marriage was invalid. And those are
Yes,
very different things,
of
right?
course.
One
Mm.
thing is whether you two were able to have a beautiful time in life together, that whether you created a happy family, whether you raised
Mm.
mentally healthy children,
Mm. Mm-hmm.
etc.
Yes, yes.
It's very different from whether that contract you celebrated in front of God and men is valid or not, right?
Yes,
So, and
yes.
you can have a very happy couple who are not validly married,
Mm.
and you can have a validly married couple who are miserable and
Yes,
who have
yes,
been cursed with that marriage. Those
of
are
course.
not completely separated from each other, but certainly different things.
Yes, yes. And turning now to canon lawyers and to yourself, why do you think that it's important for a canon lawyer to have an interior spiritual life while undertaking this work? And are there any saints? Is there scripture, theological texts that help guide the work you do?
Hmm. So I would distinguish, regarding your first question, I would distinguish two things. So to know the science of canon law, you don't need faith, right?
Hmm.
So it's similar to that thing that Saint Jakes says that the demons have faith and fear of
Mm,
God, but they don't have charity,
mm,
right? It's something like that. So you can be very knowledgeable of canon law as a science without having faith.
hmm
However, you cannot be a good minister, right? You cannot
mm,
be a good judge. You cannot be a good advocate if you don't have faith and charity, right?
okay.
Because our job well, as operators, I mean, not as scholars, right? As operators, right? Our job is to say what is right, right? Our is jus dicere, so jurisprudence, right? So it's
Mm,
to say what is right, right? In the English language, I always miss that word, right? For use, right? So it exists in every language that I know except in English, which is very frustrating because English is the language with the most words, right?
yes.
But for some reason, in other languages you don't study law, you study right or jus, diritto, recht,
Mm,
derecho in Spanish, droit in French, right? We'll have that word to mean what is right, right? Which is different from law, which is
mm,
right the mandate, right? So as jurists, which I always love to say, we're not lawyers, we're jurists, right? We are not about the letter of the law. We are about saying what is right, right? Of course, the law is very important for that,
mm,
but it's not in canon law. The center is never the law. Okay, canon law, right? The center is always the use, right?
mhm.
Is canon jus canonicum, not lex canonica. Okay, or, that's what we study. We study use, not lex. So for that, you need to be a holy person. You need the virtues, right? You need wisdom, most of all, or practical wisdom. You need justicia. You need temperance. You need all the virtues, because it's gonna be easy to be tempted, to be skewed,
Mm.
to for many different reasons. I don't know. Like, to give an example, right? If you don't have the virtue of fortitude, one of the four, maybe the other judges are going one way and you are afraid of being honest and saying what you think, right? Because
Mm.
you lack fortitude to stand up and to say what is right? If you don't have justice and temperance, maybe you feel more inclined to 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 fail in favor of the party that is more, I don't know, that you like better, right? And
Mm.
that shouldn't. That's for some reason, justice is always depicted blindfolded, right? Because
Right.
so I think it's very important to have a strong relationship with Jesus Christ if
Mhm.
you are an operator in ecclesiastical tribunals, ecclesiastical chanceries. If you
Mm.
don't if you are not infused by the virtue of charity, by the supernatural virtue of charity, if you are not inhabited by the life of the Lord, how are you gonna know what is right? How are you gonna
Yes.
distinguish right from wrong, right? And actually, I don't want to be pessimistic, but I think we need a lot of that in ecclesiastical tribunals,
Of
right? To
course.
trust the
Yes.
Lord, right? I think we forget very often the words of the Lord about marriage, right?
Mm.
We're very quick to many times, and I know this is very unpopular, but after what I said, um, right? We're very prone in general. I'm not pointing any particular fingers, right? But I'm
Mm.
just repeating the words of popes for so many decades now, that we're creating a scandal by just wanting to please the people, right? And saying, yeah, all marriages are invalid. Yeah, invalid, 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 by granting declarations of nullity left and right. We are betraying the Lord. We're betraying the Lord, who was very, very stern about this particular topic. It's weird, right? Jesus is not usually this strong, this stern about something, but with marriage, wow, that was a red line for him, right? I mean, he was not married, but he respected marriage in such a way, and his word on marriage are so tough that the disciples said, "Oh, if that's the condition of man and woman, I don't want to. I don't know if getting married is even, you know." So we really need faith to do what we do. Otherwise,
Yes.
for an operator of a court of law, it's going to be very easy to be corrupt. And I'm not talking about taking bribes, right? I'm talking about moral corruption.
Yes. Yes.
So I know, yeah, everyone wants, Catholic divorce, right? Except very few people who have been hurt by these practices. And I know
Mm.
some groups of Catholics who feel betrayed because the church has just granted the annulment to their spouses without any basis, and they are very active, but they are very few. Most people in the church, what they are asking us, is to just help me go back to the sacraments. Just help me just get back to it,
Mm.
right? And it's very easy for judges nowadays to, yeah, okay, whatever, yeah, rubber stamp, right?
Mm.
But that's
Yes.
creating Catholic divorces, and
Yes.
that is a shame, and that is moral
Mm.
corruption. And I mean, I'm not the first person to say this. Popes
Mm.
have been condemning this scandal for decades,
Yes.
saying that this
Yes.
is a scandal. This is a scandal in the biblical sense of the word, right? It's you're making people stumble in their way, in their path of faith.
Mm.
If you're telling that their word when they got married is worth nothing, what are you doing to the people, right?
Mm.
If and then uh, in a more long perspective, right? If the Catholic Church, the last defender of natural law, is destroying marriage so easily, then we
Mm.
cannot be surprised that the institution of marriage is going down, because we are
Yes.
the first
Yes.
ones to just rubber stamp any kind of bad marriage situation with an annulment, which is disgusting.
Yes.
So, and I'm going to link with your last question. I mean, the other question you were asking. about who inspires me.
Mm.
And Aquinas, I was always very moved by him. You know,
Yes.
the wisest
Yeah.
of the saints and the saintest of the wise. The way he has, and he's not a canon lawyer, right? But first, he's the only saint canonized for his teachings. I'm
Yes.
reaching out a bit here. So in
Mm.
his canonization bull, it says, tot fecit miracula sicut articula scripserat. So he made as many miracles as articles he wrote, right? So, you know, saints are not canonized because of their teachings. They are canonized because of their actions, of their virtues,
Yes. Yes.
right? But in his case, the church understands that he was such an special thinker, and he's the only one that has been officially proposed by the church as a model, right? No other author has been proposed for modelic way of thinking, not even St. Augustine, right?
Mm.
So seminarians must be imbued of the, and not so much of the actual things he taught, but of his way of thinking. And when I studied my thesis for moral theology was a study of the notion of sin in the Prima Secunde in Aquinas, and I was in love with him. It was amazing. So he has first this super simple language. You know, I am always weary of people who speak with unnecessary, difficult words. I think that's pretentious. That's a way to signal that you're smart, which in fact shows that you're not, right? Really, really smart people use simple words. If I can say this thing with a simpler word, why choose the difficult one to show off,
Yes.
right? So Aquinas is like that. So he's talking about the most difficult concepts and he's using super simple words, right?
Mm.
Short sentences. He's not pretentious at all, right? And I love his equanimity, you know. So when he's speaking about things, he used the quaestio, right? That medieval tool of thought, right? Which was first you state something, whether it is utrum, so utrum deus sit, for instance, whether there is God, right? So reasons why there seems that there is no God. A, B, C, D. Then argument of authority, el sed contra. And then respondio, I say. And then he explains what he thinks. And then he answers one by one all the arguments that opposed his idea. That, I mean, first of all, I miss that. You know, nowadays you read books and they are all like, well, explanatory, like what I'm doing right now. Yeah? I'm talking and talking and talking, right? That rigor, that I mean, they were jacked thinkers. Those brains were tough, right? They were amazing. But also, I admire very much his ability to rescue every single piece of truth in everybody. Like I remember
Yes.
one passage when he was talking about heretics, right? And he was saying, well, this group believes that this thing, and in this sense, they are right. Right? So he would always rescue, and in this sense, he was very different from St. Augustine, right? St. Augustine was a debater. He was like, he would fight and fight dirty to the point that, and in the end of his life, he writes the retractations, right? Where he,
Yes.
he goes, well, in this thing, I went so far, then I shouldn't have
Yes.
said it like this, but it was the heat of the argument.
Yes.
Actually, they say that Luther, the biggest heretic probably in the history of the church,
Mm.
right, drew from Saint Augustine from his controversies against Pelagius, right? So because Saint Augustine had that thing, Aquinas is the opposite. Aquinas is whenever there is some part of truth, I'm going to mention it and then I'm going to explain what I believe, right? For
Mm.
instance, the question of whether the devil is good, right? And he says, well, he exists. So he has the goodness of existing. So in that sense, he's good, right? Certainly, he's morally wicked. So we
Mm.
shouldn't be saying that the devil is good, but I can rescue that part. And that way of thinking is very good for a canon lawyer to be
Yes.
meticulous and to
Yes.
be very balanced. So this is true, and this other thing is true from this other perspective, but the original question was this, therefore the most appropriate answer is this. I love that thing, and it has inspired me through the years.
Yes, that's really wonderful, and thank you for sharing that. I think this is a great place to wrap up this episode, and thank you so much, Dr. Menendez, for taking the time to chat with me about the validity of marriage and particularly the grounds of error and exclusion. It's been really helpful to better understand this part of the annulment process and annulment case. But thank you also for that last part, giving us a glimpse into your spiritual journey, particularly into this great Saint Thomas Aquinas, who helps inspires your work. It's a real privilege to get to know that about you. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you, Marilyn. It's a pleasure to meet you.
Wonderful to meet you too. And for those listening, I hope this has been an insightful episode for you. I'll pop Dr. Menendez's YouTube channel and the link to his website in the bio for anyone who'd like to get in contact with him. Please subscribe and follow the podcast on Spotify and YouTube. And there's an Instagram page to stay up to date with weekly guests. And stay tuned for next week's episode. God bless.
God bless.
Gloria